Myth number 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. We are going to be looking at that the translators spoke in unison. They were perfectly unified in their linguistic decisions in much the same way that the translators of the Septuagint were also in unison together.
Yeah.
Why is that a myth? Isn't that true?
Man, good question. It's actually funny that you word it that way, because when I was raised, my mom is a King James only adherent. She's actually an author that has written a book in that movement. And when she raised us up young, she would always tell us this story about how all the translators got together in one room and they had all individually produced a translation of the Greek text, the TR. And when they got together, it was a miracle. Every one of them had translated it exactly identical, word for word.
That's funny.
And I didn't realize till years later that myth was actually about the Septuagint.
That was the Septuagint
years ago.
Yeah.
And there was a myth about the Septuagint too. But somewhere along the line, some wires had gotten crossed and someone thought that was true of the King James. And it's still, even when people don't go that far with their misinformation, you'll still regularly encounter people. If you say, for example, I think this text should be changed or corrected, and their immediate retort will be, well, who are you to correct 50 plus of the greatest scholars that ever lived?
Right.
And there's this assumption in their mind that every one of the translators all got together in a big room and came to perfect consensus about every reading of every word in the King James Bible. And it's just not true.
I say that doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen today in any translation committee. If you follow how any translation is made, there's always disagreement and debate. There's a marvelous clip on YouTube where somebody filmed the ESV.
Yeah, the doulos. Yeah.
How to translate and whether we should do slave or servant. I think it's maybe a 5 or 10 minute clip, and it's just a beautiful window into.
It was fascinating. I found it really interesting in how that.
I did too. I loved it.
Yeah,
and I would love to have been a fly on the wall during those discussions. But that takes place anytime there's a translation. And if we look at the actual documentary evidence, we can see very clearly that the King James Bible's translators sometimes debated and disagreed. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but basically the King James was created in 3 stages. Stage 1 from 1604 to 1609, you can see on the screen there, was these company drafts where people are meeting not all together. As far as we know, the translators never all got together in a big room, but you have a group of maybe 8 to 10 people in one company. And sometimes I personally think a lot of those companies probably subdivided. So you've got probably 3 or 4 people at a time meeting in a room, working on just a select portion of the text. And then in stage 2, in the general meeting, it's in Stationer's Hall in 1610, you've got 12 men around a table looking over the whole Bible. And then stage 3 is those finishing touches. So we can see through the evidence that we have today that they sometimes disagreed with each other, that there were debates, discussions. You can see there on the screen first, this is a page from Samuel Ward's personal translation of the Apocrypha. So we know that translators sit down sometimes and create individual translations. They bring it to the company. Then we've seen before this image from Bode 1602, where there's discussion and revision and debate and changes taking place within that company. And then here you can see an image of a document that's known as Manuscript 98. That's me there at Lambeth Palace Library, holding it in the front page of it. And if you look at or look through that document, you'll see it's basically composed of 2 columns. And on the left column is the Second Westminster Company's proposed revisions to the Bishop's Bible. And then that second column is actually blank. Probably that column was intended for another company to review their suggestions and make counter suggestions, but it looks like it was never employed. So maybe that particular copy, or maybe that company as a whole, didn't get through the review process they expected to. But let me give you kind of an example that'll break this down for how it might have worked.
Yeah, sure. This would be great.
Yeah, I think this can be helpful. And I've shared this with some people before, and some people don't like it, but I think it's a really helpful explanation. So one of those documents is Bode 1602. Bode 1602 in the Old Testament collects portions of text, because again, these are unbound pages that got bound together later. It collects portions of text from very late in the stages of revision. Some people have even suggested it might be the printer's proof text copy. The New Testament collects in the Gospels a series of much earlier revisions. They've actually been transcribed and printed in a wonderful edition by
that's cool.
Ward Allen and Edward Jacobs. They do some things I don't love, but it's a helpful transcription of the document. And they work through that document to show that there's actually 3 different handwriting in it, 3 different scribes that work on it that are recording changes. And so in Luke 2:22, the 1602 Bishop's text, when it talks about Mary and Joseph bringing Jesus to the temple as a young boy, it says that they do this for her purification, Mary's purification. There's no note, there's no marginal note to indicate any doubt. It just says that it was her purification. But if we look at the textual data that we have available to us today, most of the textual data reads their purification. Like almost all the Greek manuscripts in existence today say their purification. And even in the time of the King James, there was debate about it, because if we look, I don't have them in front of me right now, but if we look at like Erasmus' text and Beza's this text, they render the text differently and sometimes talk about the variant in their notes. So there's debate and discussion. Should it be her purification, meaning only Mary, or their purification, meaning either Mary and Joseph or Mary and Jesus? So there's this discussion and debate. Well, when we look at 1602, the Bode Bishop's Bible that records their changes, we see that her in the text is crossed out, and in the text there is written above it. You'll have to look really close because the handwriting can be hard to read, but if you look at it close enough, you'll see hers in the text, and somebody has made the revision to cross her out and put there above it. And then they added her in the margin. Like they wanted to signal to the reader, hey, there's some debate here, there's uncertainty, so let's list in the margin that there's another possibility, and they put her in the margin. But then someone else comes along later. We don't know if it's within the same company. My personal take on the manuscript is that this probably represents a separate company reviewing their work, but someone, whether another member of the company or another company looking over their work, comes back and says, no, we don't like that revision. And so they cross out, you can see that word there that's been written above. They cross through it and they cross through the marginal note. And instead, now they put her in the text with a marginal note that says there, still indicating some doubt, but landing on the opposite side of the question.
So somebody could have come and vetoed that too, right?
Yeah. And again, if we look at that three-stage process, we see that companies make original drafts, but the more final choices are made by just 12 men in that final committee. And I actually think that's where this third revision takes place, probably at that general meeting, as they were looking over these proposed revisions. One person had proposed there in the text and her in the margin, and another has proposed her in the text and there in the margin. There's a veto decision that's made, because as the King James gets printed in 1611, it goes back to just the reading of the bishops, her purification, and they don't make any marginal note. So that looks very much like a veto. There was debate and discussion, two different readings proposed, and a veto decision is made that says, no, we're not going to indicate any textual doubt here. We're just going to leave it the way that it is in the bishops. Again, that conservative mindset of wanting to keep traditionally to the text as much as possible. And we don't know exactly who made each of those revisions, proposed them, and who made the veto decisions. We only know the names of 3 of the men that were at that general meeting. But there's very clearly in the documentary evidence that you can see with your own eyes, there's discussion and debate where different people have different ideas about how to translate, about what to include in the margins, and in this case, even different ideas about a textual variant and which one should represent the original text. And in fact, that variant's discussed in some sermons. I won't bring it up here, but some sermons from the King James translators. And one of the things I would also note, that list of rules that we mentioned earlier that Bancroft came up with, they anticipated that there would be discussion. So in rules 9 and 10, they spell out specifically when there is debate that isn't settled in the companies, that's what this general meeting is for, is to make final veto decisions. But I say all that to say, in terms of this myth, this idea in people's minds that all the translators get together in one room and they all come to perfect unanimous agreement, and therefore every reading in the King James Bible is this unanimous decision where they all sing in unison. It's just not true. There's disagreement, there's debate, there's discussion, and in the final product, we really have more than anything else veto decisions from a smaller handful of men rather than the opinions of all the translators together.
So not at all like the Septuagint.
Not at all like the myth about the Septuagint that is sometimes also told about the King James. Not some magical perfect agreement, but just a very standard, very human process of revision, review, and a beautiful process of checks and balances, and ultimate veto decisions being made. That's how a translation should be done. It's how a translation should work.
Awesome.